Welcome to this special trilogy of Decoded by Mo, the 2026 Global Outlook. This series is for anyone trying to make sense of a world that feels heavier, faster, and more unpredictable than anything we've lived through in decades. And it's for anyone who understands that strategy, whether for a business, a government, or your own life, begins with clarity. Clarity that is about where the world is heading and where the forces are reshaping it, and about the risks and the opportunities of the moment we're stepping into. I created this trilogy because the world entering 2026 is not an ordinary world. It is a world shaped by shocks, by pain, by acceleration, by disappointment, by ambition, by exhaustion, and by deep structural changes that most people haven't fully connected yet. It's a world where the headlines don't tell the whole story and where the real story is happening in the background, in the numbers, in the geopolitics, in the generational shifts, in the data centers, in the supply chains, in the debt markets, in the climate system, in the changing values of society. For leaders and investors, this moment matters. For policymakers, it does. For people trying to build their future in a world that feels unstable, it does as well matter. The point of this trilogy is simple: to give you the full picture, not through predictions, but through understanding. And that begins by stepping back from the noise and asking a deeper question. How did we arrive here? Because 2026 isn't a fresh page. It's the result of everything that happened over the last few years. The shocks that broke old assumptions, the shifts that rebuilt new realities, and the underlying forces that haven't stopped moving. We've lived through a period that future historians will study closely. A pandemic that froze the world, supply chains that snapped, inflation returning like a ghost from the 1970s, interest rates rising at record speed, wars redrawing regional balances, technology accelerating faster than social systems can adapt, and trust in institutions that are weakening while generational expectations splitting apart. Each of these alone would have been significant. Together, they have created a world that feels like it's moving in slow motion, but under enormous internal pressure. And that's why here in episode 1, I don't begin with numbers, but with a story. Not with a forecast, but with a context. Not with optimism or pessimism, but with the truth. This episode traces the path that led into 2026, the decade of shocks, the return of geopolitics, the moral weight of human suffering, and the rise of multipolar world in a generational divide and the global mood that shapes every forecast we'll discuss. Because before we can understand the future, we have to understand the moment we're standing in, clearly, calmly, and without illusions. To understand the world entering 2026, we need to look back at the decade that shaped it. A decade that did not unfold gradually but violently, like history compressed into a tight space. We lived through events that normally belong to a different era: a global pandemic, inflation shocks from the 1970s, geopolitical ruptures reminiscent of the mid 20th century, and a technological leap as profound as the early internet age, all happening simultaneously and all feeding into each other. The 2020s began with a moment that the modern world was not prepared for. A virus brought the global economy into a standstill. Streets emptied, airports shut down, offices closed, and borders hardened. It didn't matter whether you were in Europe, Asia, Africa, or the Americas. The world suddenly became small, vulnerable, and interconnected in ways we hadn't even noticed before. But while the pandemic was a health crisis, its economic impact was historic. Governments deployed fiscal stimulus at levels unseen since wartime economies. Trillions were pumped into markets to prevent a collapse. Central banks slashed interest rates to zero, or even below zero in some countries. It was an economic life support system that kept societies functioning, but it planted the seeds of the inflation to come. When the world reopened, it reopened unevenly. Demand came back instantly, supply did not. Factories were behind. Ports were jammed, shipping containers were stuck in the wrong places. A microchip shortage something invisible to most people just a month earlier, suddenly halted car production, medical devices, and even home appliances. Inflation followed like a crazy wave, not gently but sharply, the highest in more than 40 years. Food prices surged, housing became more expensive, energy turned volatile, families felt squeezed in a way they didn't experience in a generation. For older people, this felt like a return of something they remembered from the 1970s. For younger people, it was the first encounter with an economy that didn't feel predictable. Central banks responded with a speed that surprised even financial historians. The era of free money ended abruptly. Interest rates rose faster than at any moment since the early 80s. Mortgages doubled, credit tightened, venture capital dried up. Companies that had grown accustomed to cheap borrowing had to rethink their entire business models. The aftermath was global. So the investment slowed, real estate market froze, currencies became volatile, and governments faced heavier debt burdens. As the economic shocks landed, a second wave of disruption emerged, this time geopolitical. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 shattered the illusion that Europe was permanently safe. The war wasn't just about territory, it was about the structure of the global order. It changed energy flows, forcing Europe to rapidly reduce its dependence on Russian gas. It reshaped defense spending, it redrew alliance networks, and it created a new sense of vulnerability that Europe had not felt since the Cold War. Across the African continent, particularly in the Sahel, a chain of coups destabilized entire regions. Traditional influence patterns shifted. New alliances formed. Many countries found themselves caught between rival powers offering security, resources, or investment, but with competing agendas. The Red Sea and Horn of Africa faced instability that affected global shipping routes. Suddenly, the world realized that a conflict in one of the narrow maritime corridor could disrupt supply chains from Asia to Europe. Something as simple as a container ship route became a geopolitical risk variable. And in the Indo-Pacific, the rivalry between China and the United States grew sharper. More military encounters at sea, more diplomatic tension, and more strategic repositioning by Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and South Korea. The region became the center of gravity for the global balance of power and the likely origin of any major conflict that could reshape global markets. Amid all these pressures, something else happened, something that wasn't a crisis but a transformation: the acceleration of artificial intelligence. AI had existed for decades as an academic discipline and a technological aspiration, but between 2023 and 2025, it crossed a threshold. Large language models, autonomous systems, and generative AI tools moved from prototypes into industries. Suddenly, CEOs, governments, and universities were forced to adapt to a world where automation could rewrite entire sectors and where compute, data centers, chips, and energy became a strategic resource. AI didn't create one big shock. It created a silent revolution. It changed hiring, investment, education, logistics, healthcare, and defense. It forced nations to rethink sovereignty. It exposed the limits of regulation, and it deepened the divide between those who understand the technology and those who fear it. All of these forces converged into something deeper: a slow erosion of confidence. Confidence in economic systems, confidence in globalization, confidence in political stability, and confidence in institutions that once felt unshakable. By the time we approach 2026, this erosion of trust has become part of the global atmosphere. Not a panic, not a collapse, but a quiet heaviness. A sense that the world is still moving but under pressure. A sense that the shocks of the decade didn't end. They simply changed shape. And this sets the stage for what comes next. Not only economic uncertainty, but the full return of geopolitics. Wars, power shifts, moral crises, and the strategic realignments that will define the world entering 2026. As the world struggled through the economic turbulence of the early 2020s, another force pushed its way back into the center of global reality: geopolitics. For most of the last 3 decades, many believed the world had moved past the age of raw power politics. The post-Cold War era gave us a sense of inevitability, that globalization would gradually soften rivalries, that economic interdependence wouldn't prevent major conflicts, and that the world's great powers would be too rational to risk instability. But history doesn't move into straight lines. And by the mid 2020s, geopolitics returned with a force that surprised even those who study it for a living. The first rupture came from Europe. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 marked the most significant military conflict on European soil since World War II. The war wasn't only about territory, it was a shock to the global system. Suddenly, energy markets were weaponized. Food exports became vulnerable. Nuclear threats returned to diplomatic language. Europe's security assumptions collapsed overnight. Countries that long believed in neutrality reconsidered their position. Defense budgets surged across the continent, and NATO expanded for the first time in years. Europe was forced to scramble to rebuild an energy strategy that could survive without Russian gas. This conflict reshaped global alliances far beyond Europe. It forced the Gulf into delicate balancing. It pushed China closer to Moscow politically while testing its economic relationships with the West. It influenced elections and political narratives across the world. And the war showed something deeper, that the assumption of stability built since 1991 could no longer be relied upon. But the turbulence wasn't limited to Europe. Across Africa, especially in the Sahel, a wave of military coups destabilized entire regions. The strategic map of West and Central Africa changed almost completely within a few years. Former Western alliances weakened. New partnerships with Russia, Turkey, and China emerged. The region took on renewed strategic weight because of its minerals, demographics, and geography, but under conditions of rising insecurity and humanitarian stress. In the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea, a different kind of turbulence emerged. Shipping routes, the arteries of the global trade, came under threat. Attacks on container vessels disrupted flows of goods between Asia and Europe. Insurance premiums skyrocketed. Supply chains experienced spikes of unpredictability, and a crisis that began in one narrow maritime corridor rippled through the global economy. Further east into the Indo-Pacific became the primary theater of great power competition. China increased military pressure on Taiwan. Japan made its largest defense shift in over 70 years. Australia and the US deepened the AUKUS alliance. The Philippines repositioned itself strategically after years of drift. And the South China Sea, through which 1/3 of the global trade flows, became a zone where any miscalculation could trigger a global shock. But all of the geopolitical events shaping the world entering 2026, none carried more emotional and moral weight than Gaza. By early 2025, the scale of destruction and civilian suffering in Gaza led the UN's International Court of Justice to rule that there was a plausible risk of genocide under Genocide Convention. In parallel, UN special rapporteurs and human rights experts referred to the situation as genocidal in nature, marking one of the gravest warnings issued by the UN system in decades. This was not a marginal statement. It was a historic one, a moment that reshaped global politics and public consciousness. Gaza became a turning point, politically, socially, and morally. It fueled mass protests across Europe, US, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. It strained relations between Western governments and their own populations. It widened the divide between the global North and global South. It undermined the credibility of international institutions, and it forced countries across the Middle East to reconsider long-standing diplomatic positions. The humanitarian tragedy in Gaza didn't just add to global instability, it changed the emotional climate of the world. It amplified the sense of injustice and fragmentation already present. It accelerated the shift toward multipolarity, where non-Western regions began asserting their own interpretations of international law, human rights, and security. This is why The Economist lists war or peace and geopolitical drift among the top global trends of 2026, because we are living in a period where conflicts do not remain contained. They spread through supply chains, politics, energy markets, values, and public sentiment. And because the world is not sliding into a single crisis or a single direction, it's drifting in many directions at once. The return of geopolitics is not just about war. It's about uncertainty. It's about rethinking alliances. It's about questioning old assumptions. And it is about a world discovering that stability is no longer the default setting. And this geopolitical landscape is the canvas on which the rest of 2026 global outlook is painted. As the geopolitical pressures of early 2020s unfolded, another transformation, quieter but more structural, reshaped the international system. The idea of a single unified global order began to dissolve, replaced by something more complex, a multipolar world, built not around one center of power, but around several. For 3 decades after the Cold War, the world operated under a loose assumption that globalization would naturally lead to convergence, that economic interdependence would reduce conflict, align interests, and eventually create a world where borders, alliances, and spheres of influence mattered less. But by mid 2020s, that assumption no longer held. Instead of convergence, the world began to split into overlapping blocks, not rigid alliances like the 20th century, but flexible, shifting networks of interests. The fragmentation is not ideological, it is strategic, it is economic, it is technological, and it is accelerating. The United States remained the anchor of the global financial system and the engine of technological innovation. But its political polarization, its internal battles over identity, and its shifting foreign policy priorities affect the entire world. As The Economist notes, America's upcoming 250th anniversary is not just a milestone. It's a moment of reflection for a country whose domestic divisions directly shape its global influence. The US is still powerful, but its predictability is not what it once was. China, meanwhile, is no longer the unstoppable growth machine of the early 2000s. It faces slower growth, demographic decline, and a property crisis. Yet, its global influence has expanded through investments, manufacturing dominance, strategic partnerships, and infrastructure diplomacy. Where the West hesitates, China acts. Its opportunity, as The Economist puts it, lies in the openings created by Western fragmentation and distraction. Europe, wealthy and institutionally mature, is navigating its own internal drift. Economic slowdown, political polarization, energy uncertainties, demographic pressure, and the rise of the far right have created a sense of strategic confusion. Europe wants to be a political actor, but often finds itself reacting rather than shaping. Problems for Europe is not just an Economist headline, it's a reflection of a continent trying to balance values, vulnerability, and ambition in a world moving faster than its institutions. India emerges as a different kind of pole, confident, young, and increasingly central to global supply chains, digital infrastructure, and energy diplomacy. It is no longer just a large market. It is becoming a strategic hub between East and West, North and South. The Gulf states, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, have transformed into global players with influence far beyond their size. They act as brokers, investors, mediators, and technological accelerators. Their sovereign funds shape global finance. Their diplomacy bridges worlds. Their strategic positioning gives them leverage in energy, logistics, and technology, especially as the global energy transition intensifies. Africa, long seen through a narrow lens of development, is emerging as a strategic frontier. Its young population, natural resources, urbanization, and technological leapfrogging position it as a future power center, but one navigating significant governance and security challenges. Major powers compete for influence there, not through ideology, but through infrastructure, minerals, and markets. Latin America's role is also changing. Resource rich, strategically located, and increasingly influential in the climate and energy conversation. The region finds itself pulled between investment from China, political ties with the US, and the growing influence from Europe and the Gulf. And then there is Central Asia, once peripheral, now sitting between competing trade corridors, energy routes, and digital networks. Countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Azerbaijan have become essential connectors between Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. This is what multipolarity looks like in practice. Not a new Cold War, not a world split in two, but a world with several gravitational centers, each pulling in different directions. This fragmentation affects everything: trade agreements, supply chains, currencies, technology standards, AI regulations, data governance, energy alliances, and even cultural influence. The globalization of the 1990s and early 2000s has not died. It has become conditional. Countries no longer ask, how do we integrate into the global economy? They ask, which networks do we want to belong to and on what terms? This is the world entering 2026. Interconnected but not unified, competitive but not coordinated, fragmented yet still dependent on one another. A world where power is dispersed, alliances are fluid, and strategy matters more than ideology. Beneath the geopolitical shifts, economic shocks, and structural transformations shaping the world entering 2026, another divide has been widening quietly, not between countries, but within them. A divide that doesn't appear in forecasts or policy papers, yet shapes politics, markets, cultural movements, and even how societies interpret global events. The generational divide. For older generations, the world was built on a certain narrative, a narrative of institutions that worked, of stability that lasted, of careers that unfolded predictably, of housing that was affordable, and of a global system that seemed to improve with time. Their adulthood began in an environment where the future felt clear, where success felt reachable, and where progress, economic, political, and social, was assumed to be a natural direction. For younger generations, the story is almost the opposite. They entered adulthood in a world defined not by stability, but by disruption. They lived through financial crisis, through political polarization, through droughts, fires, and climate anxiety. They witnessed pandemics, supply chain collapses, inflation spikes, job insecurity, unaffordable housing, and now the uncertainty of AI transforming entire professions. They inherited a world that felt like it was already in motion, but not necessarily in the right direction. This generational divergence is not superficial. It shapes expectations, behavior, social trust, and political alignment. It influences attitudes towards work, consumption, debt, institutions, and global justice. It defines how different groups interpret the same event, whether economic policy, foreign policy, or humanitarian tragedy. Younger generations tend to distrust systems that older generations grew up trusting. Banks, political parties, traditional media, and governmental institutions are examples. Their trust is horizontal in peers, networks, creators, and communities rather than vertical. All generations see AI as a tool. Younger generations see it as a threat and an opportunity simultaneously, a force that could erase old pathways but also create new ones. Older generations prioritize stability. Younger generations prioritize fairness. Older generations fear disorder. Younger generations fear irrelevance. This difference extends into geopolitics as well. When younger people look at the global conflicts, they interpret them through moral frameworks shaped by the internet, identity, and lived insecurity. They demand accountability, justice, and clarity. They protest more. They reject double standards. They question narratives that older generations might accept as part of geopolitical reality. This shift explains why events like Gaza resonated so intensely with younger people around the world, not only because of the human suffering, but because it fit into a broader emotional map, a world where institutions feel selective, where power feels unbalanced, and where the promise of progress feels broken. The generational divide also affects the economy. Younger generations carry rising debt. They delay home ownership. They rent longer. They change jobs more frequently. They invest differently, often with skepticism, often with caution. And they consume according to values: climate, ethics, transparency. Older generations hold wealth, younger generations hold cultural influence. Both forces matter and both shape the world entering 2026. This divide doesn't break societies, but it adds a layer of tension to everything, from technology adoption to elections to global diplomacy. It creates a world where people live in the same moment, but not in the same emotional reality. And understanding that gap is essential for understanding the global outlook. Because strategy doesn't only respond to numbers and geopolitics, it responds to people. When you look at how major institutions describe 2026, something striking emerges. They are looking at the same world, but they are describing it from slightly different angles, with slightly different anxieties and slightly different hopes. What they agree on is just as revealing as where they differ. Together, they outline a global mood, a cautious, uneven, fragile sense of where the world is heading. The World Bank is the most sober. Their assessment is almost historical. They warn that the 2020s could become the weakest decade for global growth since 1960s. Their language is careful, but the message is clear. The world is growing, but slowly. Investment is too weak. Debt is too high. Productivity is too low. Trade is too fragmented, and climate shocks, political instability, and fiscal constraints are pulling economies in different directions. Their forecast hovers around modest global growth, with little sign of strong rebound. The IMF sees something similar but frames it differently. They project global growth around 3%, not recession, not expansion, just a flat line. They highlight divergence: advanced economies slowing towards the 1-2% range, emerging markets growing closer to the 4-5%. But beneath this, the IMF sends a warning that the world is becoming more vulnerable. Trade tensions, higher borrowing costs, and political uncertainty make the global economy sensitive to shocks that in the past it might have absorbed more easily. The OECD adds another layer: the cost of fragmentation. They warn that rising tariffs, weaponized supply chains, sanctions, and the decline of global coordination are slowing investment and complicating long term planning. In their view, uncertainty itself has become an economic drag. Companies hesitate, governments hesitate, and in that hesitation, growth slows. They also stress something often overlooked. Inflation may have peaked, but it has not disappeared. Underneath the decline are stubborn structural pressures: energy, wages, demographics that keep prices sensitive. Then comes Morgan Stanley, whose view stands out slightly from the others. They are not optimistic in a traditional sense. They do not predict a boom, but they do see potential tailwinds. Their analysis highlights the capital pouring into artificial intelligence, data centers, chips, and digital infrastructure. For them, this investment wave acts like a new industrial cycle, capable of uplifting productivity and supporting growth, especially in the United States. They acknowledge risks, but they see the AI built out as a genuine engine in an otherwise slow world. And finally, we have The Economist, whose World Ahead 2026 trends add nuance and texture. Their business forecasts point into an economy shaped less by acceleration and more by adaptation. They highlight economic worries: the sense that rich countries are living beyond their means, carrying heavy debt loads that could eventually become dangerous. They warn that the AI boom may be masking deeper weaknesses: low productivity in traditional sectors, aging workforces, sluggish investments outside technology. They also highlight the uneven nature of the energy transition. Clean tech is booming, but transitions are messy. Some industries are being transformed, others are stuck. Some regions are leapfrogging, others are left behind. They see climate economic impact becoming more visible, from insurance markets to food prices to infrastructure stress. And they add an unexpected but important element: the rise of the GLP-1 drugs, the Ozempic wave. and its potential to reshape industries from healthcare to food and beverage. It's a reminder that the forces shaping the world are not always those that dominate political discussions. When you put all these institutional views together, a single picture emerges. 2026 is a year of limited growth, persistent risk, and quiet transformation. A year where the global economy moves forward, but carefully. A year shaped by caution more than ambition. A year where uncertainty is not temporary, but it's a part of the system. And it's this mix: slow growth, high stakes, fragmented coordination, and accelerated technological investment that forms the economic environment leaders must navigate. Beneath the headlines, beneath the forecasts, beneath the political noise, the world entering 2026 is shaped by deeper forces. Structural forces that move slowly but powerfully, like currents beneath the surface of the oceans. These forces don't change from one year to another, but they define the world trajectory. They determine what's possible, what's fragile, and what's inevitable. The first and most transformative of these forces is technology, especially artificial intelligence. AI is no longer an industry, it is becoming an underlying infrastructure of the global economy. Every sector, finance, healthcare, logistics, security, manufacturing, education, is being reshaped by automation, prediction, personalization, and synthetic content. The race for compute capacity has become geopolitical. Nations are competing for chips the way they once competed for oil. Data centers have become strategic assets, and a handful of companies and governments hold the keys to the most advanced models. But the acceleration of AI also exposes fractures. The gap between countries that can deploy advanced AI and those who can't is widening. The gap between workers whose jobs complement AI and those whose jobs are threatened is widening. And the gap between the regulation and innovation grows larger with each new breakthrough. The second force is energy, reshaped by security concerns, climate pressures, and technological change. The global energy transition is not a smooth curve. It is a messy, uneven redesign of systems that have been in place for a century. Renewables are rising. Fossil fuels are still dominant, and grids are under stress. Investment flows are shifting toward hydrogen, nuclear storage, and smart grids. But fossil infrastructure still underwrites global stability. Countries that sit on critical minerals, cobalt, nickel, lithium, copper, find themselves with new leverage. The Gulf states reinvent themselves as energy tech hybrids. And Europe, after the shock of losing Russian gas, accelerates its diversification with urgency. The third force is climate, not just as an environmental issue, but as an economic variable. Extreme heat disrupts agriculture, floods destroys infrastructure, fires reshape insurance markets, water scarcity becomes geopolitical. Food systems come under pressure, and climate events, once considered risks, now act as a recurring, predictable disruptors of economic activity. This is why institutional forecasts increasingly mention climate in the same breath as growth, inflation, and trade. The fourth force is inequality, which increasingly defines political and social stability. The cost of living crisis, wage stagnation, house unaffordability, and debt burdens create pressure from below. Meanwhile, asset concentration at top creates pressure from above. This tension fuels political fragmentation, generational resentment, and social movements that ripple through markets and elections. And the fifth force is demographics. Aging populations in Europe, East Asia, and North America reshape labor markets and fiscal balances. Youthful populations in Africa, South Asia, and parts of the Middle East create opportunities for growth. If education, employment, and stability keep pace, migration becomes both a necessity and a political flashpoint, and demographic weight begins shifting the center of global demand, talent, and innovation away from the traditional powers. These structural forces rarely make sudden headlines, but they shape everything. Which alliances deepen, which industries grow, which risks intensify, and which opportunities become possible. They form the undercurrent of the global 2026 outlook, steady, powerful, and unavoidable. When you step back and look at everything shaping the world entering 2026, the shocks of the early decade, the return of geopolitics, the moral weight of Gaza, the rise of multipolarity, the generational divide, the cautious forecasts, and the deep structural forces, a certain picture begins to emerge. It is not a picture of crisis, nor of one of confidence. It is a picture of slow motion. A world still moving, but under tension. A world that is trying to regain balance, but on the ground that keeps shifting. In this environment, strategy becomes something different from what it was in years of globalization's peak. It becomes less about chasing the highest growth and more about understanding the architecture of the world, less about reacting to the headlines and more about recognizing the underlying currents shaping them, less about predicting the next shock and more about building resilience against it. Because the world entering 2026 rewards something very simple: clarity. Clarity about where the risks live: in fragmentation, in political fatigue, in climate volatility, in inequality, and in overstretched institutions. Clarity about where the opportunities lie: in technology, in energy transitions, in digital infrastructure, in demographic growth markets, in regions rising quietly outside the old centers of power. Clarity about the world's emotional landscape, a landscape shaped by exhaustion, by grief, by moral questioning, by generational change. This clarity isn't just intellectual, it's strategic. It shapes how companies allocate capital, how governments design policies, and how investors think about risk and how societies imagine their future. Understanding the world as it truly is, not as we wish it to be, is the foundation for navigating what comes next. And this is where episode 2 begins, beneath the surface, inside the engines of the future: AI, energy, climate, compute, and the technologies and systems that will determine the shape of the decade ahead. But before we go there, this is the world we stand in. This is the ground beneath our feet. This is the world in slow motion. Thanks again for listening. I hope I brought some clarity to a topic that is burdening all of us. I would definitely appreciate if you share it with someone who would love to listen to more. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and peace be with you.